everyone. My name is Savannah, and I'm the Digital Marketing Manager here at the Council and the producer behind the CounciLIVE broadcast series. Today, I'm honored to have the chance to interview Dr. Ryan Lee James, the director of the Atlanta Speech School's Rollins Center for Language and Literacy. Welcome, Dr. Ryan Lee James. How are you this afternoon?
Doing so good. Hi, Savannah. It's nice to see you, and I'm so grateful to have been invited to share my experience, share a little bit about my role as the director for the Rollins Center. So thank you so much for that warm welcome.
Oh, fantastic. Well, we're so excited to speak with you today. And before we begin our conversation, we'd love if you could share with the audience a bit about you, your experience in academia, and the role you play now in the early childhood field.
Sure. So again, thank you for this opportunity to be here. I'm going to share a little bit with you specifically about my role at the Rollins Center and a little bit about what we're about. I know we have some other questions that are going to be included here around my experience and my background. And so let me just share a little bit with you about the Rollins Center. So my name is Ryan Lee James. Again, I serve as the director of the Rollins Center for Language and Literacy at the Atlanta Speech School. I'm also a speech language pathologist by training. The Atlanta Speech School is an 83-year-old institution that was founded as a school for the deaf by Catherine Ham. Today, the Atlanta Speech School is a robust, comprehensive language and literacy center made up of 4 schools, a speech language hearing clinic that serves the larger community, and the Rollins Center for Language and Literacy. And we sort of consider ourselves the professional learning arm of the Atlanta Speech School. Our mission at the Rollins Center is to eradicate illiteracy by getting the early brain science, the science of language and reading, into the hands of every child-facing adult, including caregivers, teachers, public health care professionals, and the list goes on. With emphasis on children and families who have experienced generational lack of access to quality education. Our focus is on the continuum from P to literacy. In this case, we think of the P as standing for prenatal, because we know that the science tells us that early sound awareness begins to develop in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy when the baby is still in utero. This development of language continues in context from 0 to 5 through a child's rich interactions with adults in their environment, beginning in pre-K and continuing until the child has mastered rules for decoding. Literacy instruction should be explicit. And thanks to our generous funders, on our free online Cox campus, we're able to provide guidance to child-facing adults on how to construct a deep reading brain along that continuum. Important to say that at the Rollins Center and at the Atlanta Speech School, we view literacy as a vehicle, but not the destination.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Our vision at CounciLIVE is to bring to our audience expert voices on the most important issues and topics in early childhood education today. And an evergreen topic that touches on so many of our CDA core competency functional areas, including communication and families, is the focus of your work, and that's language and literacy development. So as we begin to dive in today, we always love to hear from our guests. What led you to your passion for research and work in literacy development? And what is the driving force that animates your work today?
Well, that's another good question, Savannah. So, anytime somebody asks me like how I stumbled upon this career path, it's actually a really boring story. So I was in college as a freshman, around, I guess, 2005. And I was trying to figure out, okay, what am I going to do? So I went to the Career Service Center, because I'm sort of like a rule follower in that way, like at orientation. They're like, go to the Career Service Center and take an assessment. So I went and took an assessment, and this assessment, the results geared me towards becoming a speech language pathologist or a teacher. And so I took a couple of classes in speech and language and fell in love. But I have to say that my passion for this work overall is really rooted in social justice and my undying love for language, believing that every child deserves the right to decide their own future. And really realizing that anything less than that is criminal and unjust. In the United States, you're probably aware, as well as many of our listeners today, that we are facing an illiteracy epidemic. And this is not new, one that's been exacerbated by COVID, but certainly not new. And while we know that all children across the United States are impacted by this, regardless of race, ethnicity, zip code, there are certain groups that are being disproportionately impacted, specifically our children of color, our children from lower SES, lower socioeconomic status backgrounds, and English language learners. And when I think about what brought me to this work is, what's the foundation and prerequisite for literacy? Well, it's language. It's oral language, expressive and receptive, phonology, morphology, syntax, all of those language systems. As I mentioned, I'm an SLP by training, and so my experience and expertise is around language development and language disorders, and reading. And later I added literacy and reading as an area of specialization. But my first love is language. And at the Rollins Center, I'm blessed to be able to marry my love for language, literacy, and equity as we work toward ensuring that every child is on a path to deciding their own future. Again, literacy is a destination to self-determination, and we recognize that society's standards for reading proficiency barely scratch the surface of what we mean by the deep reading brain. So beyond, if I could just say a little more about this, beyond proficiency as we think about it, decoding and literal comprehension, our goal is much greater, a goal of deeper, a more analytic reading brain. And for our children, what it can bring with it, as I already said, a life of self-determination. Children who have the ability to decode and comprehend well can learn to process what they read through the lens of a deep reading brain, a brain that analyzes, thinks critically, and takes the perspective of others while feeling empathy for their plight. A deep reading brain demonstrates personal reflection as it imagines a better choice and a better idea of our world. When we talk about equity, literacy, deep literacy should always be at the forefront. All of our children deserve a deep reading brain. And this understanding of the deep reading brain comes from the research of Dr. Marianne Wolf in her book, Reader Come Home, where she says, our best research tells us that deep reading is an essential skill for the development of intellectual, social, and emotional intelligence of today's children. And so your question around what motivates me, what brought me to the Rollins Center, it is the Speech School's commitment to ensuring that each child within our walls, so I think I mentioned that that the Speech School includes 6 programs overall, 4 schools that serve children on campus, a clinic that serves the community, and the Rollins Center. So what really brought me to this work is the Speech School's understanding of the deep reading brain, how we conceptualize the continuum from 3rd trimester through 3rd grade, all through the lens of equity.
I absolutely love that. And I feel that connection between developing the deep reading brain and socioeconomic equity and social justice is so seldom articulated, but you can absolutely see the power in that if a child can learn eventually to be able to read a book or a news article and immediately synthesize and realize, I don't agree with that. And I'm going to,
absolutely. And what's so unique about our work, Savannah, is that we're conceptualizing the deep reading brain beginning in the 3rd trimester when a baby is still in utero, following the work of Dr. Patricia Kuhl, where she finds and reports that sound awareness is developing when babies are still in utero. So if we understand that early sound awareness later becomes the ability to manipulate phonemes, or the definition of phonemic and phonological awareness, right? That we can begin to understand how teaching and learning doesn't happen when children enter pre-K. This work happens when mom is still carrying a baby. Importantly, what's all of our role in that, right? Like, what's the role of the public healthcare professional? What's the role of the doctor and pediatrician? What's the role of the early childhood teacher? What's the role of the caregiver? I mean, we all play a role. And so I know we're going to talk later about this ecosystem approach to really, I don't want to say child rearing, but to ensuring that all of our children are on that path. And so though some of what I'm talking about might, okay, wait, she's talking about some of the work that happens later in the kindergarten through third grade space. Yes. And that work continues, but it starts in the third trimester of pregnancy.
Thank you. And that is actually a perfect segue to our next question. And I'll just give a brief aside to our audience here. For those of you who have not yet heard about the Rollins Center until today, the center is, and I'm quoting from their website here, dedicated to comprehensive literacy and the construction of the reading brain for every child. And the center takes a whole child approach, which I'm sure you've discerned from Dr. Ryan Lee James' conversation so far. And I love this description, as you've just referenced, building ecosystems that are conducive to literacy, where connection is valued over compliance, where children feel safe and supported, and where deep reading is enabled. So, Dr. Ryan Lee James, from your perspective as the center director, how do you see the center's work as addressing a critical need in the early childhood education landscape?
Sure. So I can say this really simply, because I know I'm saying a lot. I've said a lot already. We're only on question 2 or 3. But simply put, our work provides evidence-based practices and resources for that deep reading brain that we've been talking about to this point. We synthesize the science as it exists and make that science available on our Cox campus for free, not behind a paywall where only some teachers or some leaders can access it. Research shows us that changes in adult behavior can lead to positive child outcomes for children. So on the Cox campus, our goal and what we try to bring to everyone through our work is the formula for creating those ecosystems. What does it look like to create a language-rich ecosystem? What does it look like to create an ecosystem where not only children, but their families are thriving? And so that's really the contribution that I see for the Rollins Center via the Cox campus. Again, and thankful, and we're really extremely grateful for our funders who have made it possible for us to bring this to the masses across the United States and overseas, internationally for free. So I guess, yeah, again, simply put, what our contribution is, what the critical need that we're addressing is lack of access. I mean, teachers, families, especially the families that we talked about who have been most disproportionately impacted by the illiteracy epidemic, those who have been disproportionately impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, are children of color, families of color, families who have historically had a generational lack of access. And so the role that we see, our moral obligation and commitment to equity is ensuring that lack of access is not a barrier any longer for being able to build a child's deep reading brain. And so that's what we see our contribution being. I should also add that the science is being implemented, the early brain science around language and literacy is being implemented with fidelity every single day on our in-person campus at the Atlanta Speech School. And so taking that, what we know works, and being able to disseminate it via Cox campus is our legacy through the Rollins Center.
Thank you so much. And we are so delighted to be a partner of the Rollins Center. And as we touched on briefly, I was struck when reading through your website by the social, interpersonal, and communal dimensions of the center's mission. And we talked about building ecosystems, valuing connection. So many of our audience members work in preschools, home-based child care centers, or home visitation with children aged birth to 5. So from your perspective, what do you feel is most important for early educators to understand about those social and communal elements of language and literacy development? And how should this inform teacher relationships with young children's families?
Yeah, so that's a really important topic, a really important question that you're asking. And some of what I'm going to say here is going to sound redundant, but let me try to break it down even further, given the question that you've asked. So the foundation for our work includes an understanding that there are critical prerequisites for learning. So earlier I talked about oral language being the foundation for learning, and that is true. We know that oral language develops in context through rich interactions. We know that a child's vocabulary, phonology, morphology, syntax, in the birth to 5 space, children are learning those language systems implicitly, right? We don't sit down and say, okay, the way that we construct a sentence is subject, verb, object. Children learn that. Our brains are wired for oral language, but not necessarily for reading. So when I talk about oral language as being a foundation or a prerequisite for literacy, that is true. But there are even prerequisites to that prerequisite, right? When we think about what's critical even for language learning, research tells us that before we're able to access the brain circuit for learning, children must experience relationships of care in environments where they feel safety and trust. We're grateful to partner closely with Dr. Renee Boynton-Jarrett, who's a pediatrician, an expert in trauma-informed care at Boston Medical. Her work really informs what we do. So we know that relationships of care, safety, and trust are critical. Another prerequisite is that children are immersed in a curriculum, in an environment in which they see positive images of themselves, an environment that values cultural and linguistic diversity, and the various experiences that children bring with them to the classroom. So if we can think about that for just a second, what does that mean for the engagement and the interaction that has to happen between educators and families, right? Critical. It's also critical for educators across the continuum to understand that healthy development, construction of the deep reading brain, as I said, can only happen in relationships of care. Ralph Smith, the managing director for the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, recently said that schools will be welcoming the most developmentally diverse group of students in recent history. So children and families and teachers need to work closely together. These relationships of care that I'm referring to don't just mean relationships between teacher and family. I'm talking about the relationship between caregiver and child, the relationship between the teacher and the family, but also that critical relationship between the teacher and the child, right? Children have got to know, children have got to feel safe and have got to be able to trust the adults in their environment before we can even think about instructing around phonemic awareness, before we can even think about instructing around vocabulary, before we can even think about assessment. And so for me, the science really provides a roadmap for what needs to happen on day one when kids return to school. Day one, preschool, pre-K, our infant and toddler classrooms, we've got to be all about building relationships. The good news is we can build relationships using language. And so these things are inextricably tied, right? But I think to your point, what's on the top of mind for everyone now, even families, is the learning loss that our kids may have experienced. So whether our kids have been removed from an early childhood setting and are going to go back or going to return to pre-K without, having that without having that experience in an early learning center, we cannot allow ourselves to become over or hyper focused on literacy in language. We've got to start with those relationships of care.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And that really shows that all of our CDA functional areas that focus on safety, that focus on inclusion, representation, equity, all of these things are a part of that big ecosystem. So thank you.
Which is why we're so grateful to be in partnership with you guys. I mean, the alignment across organizations, right, is between yours and the Rollins Center is really staggering. So again, just grateful, as you've already pointed out, grateful to be in partnership with you guys.
Does any particular moment, story, or interaction stand out as a moment of gratitude or a reminder of the power of the work that everyone at the center is doing every day?
I cannot think of, so I should say that I came to the Rollins Center as the director about a year and a half ago. So I'm still very new to this work when I think about my colleagues who have a tenure of over 10 years at the Rollins Center. But I can't think of any one instance, Savannah. What is most powerful to me is when I get an opportunity to hear from Cox campus educators in the early learning space who have taken Cox campus coursework, who have engaged with our resources and our community discussion on Cox campus. When I hear their testimony saying things like, I have been able to change my practices for the better because I've engaged with Cox campus. I mean, those instances are so powerful for me because, again, our theory of change, the research tells us that the only way to change to improve child outcomes is through a change in adult behavior. And so when we have early learning teachers engaged on the Cox campus saying, my practices have changed for the better, that is extremely powerful and is a regular pulse check for us to say, we are in steps working to achieve our lofty mission of eradicating illiteracy.
Thank you so much. And everyone, again, we will put a link in the description. Please visit those resources online. Turning a bit toward the academic side of your work. During your graduate programs and time as an assistant professor, it seems that African American English, or AAE, was a central part of your research. So how does your academic research on the intersection of socioeconomic status, dialect, and language development inform the work you do today at the Rollins Center?
Sure. So as you noted, before I came to the Rollins Center as the director, I was working at a university as a tenure track professor in the Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders. So I've already said that I'm a speech language pathologist by training. I should add that my early clinical work was all focused on early intervention in the 0 to 3 space, working closely with families of children who had been identified or diagnosed as having language delay or early language disorder, and working with families and building capacity so that they could work and build their child's language skills. So my career in teaching and training graduate level pre-service educators and speech language pathologists, as well as my career in research, really informs everything I do, especially in my role as center director. In fact, my career in academia made me realize my deep desire to contribute to the field more directly and in ways that are more practical. But having deep knowledge of how language and literacy develop in the context of differences, as you noted, dialect differences, other linguistic differences, second language acquisition, really is extremely important in the work that I do, because at the Rollins Center, we develop content rooted in best practices for all children, right? So not just children from the majority culture, but all children. Importantly, having been responsible for teaching and training our future generation of educators, I have an understanding of where there are gaps in our pre-service education. And through the Cox campus, we aim to build agency, authority, and expertise in our members so that they can constantly serve our nation's children. I know from working in through teaching that a lot of our early childhood educators are graduating with their bachelor's or even their associate's degree without having a full understanding of the scope of language development, what that development looks like, red flags when that development is not happening as it should. And I know that our educators are in many instances lacking knowledge in that area. And so it's been a privilege of mine to be able to bring that knowledge with me to the Rollins Center and continue to build what we have on Cox campus. Again, I'm new to the Rollins Center, about a year and a half in. We have a really robust suite of early learning content. And I've just been blessed as a part of my role to be able to contribute and add to that.
Thank you so much. And for all those also listening, soon we will have a CounciLIVE episode on dual language learning specifically by our wonderful member of the council, Vilma M. Williams. So stay tuned for that as well.
Awesome. I can't wait for that.
Yes, very exciting. So our book, The Essentials for Working with Young Children, which all CDA holders read, does provide guidance on understanding language and literacy development for children aged birth to 5. It includes guidance on building language skills, providing a print-rich setting, establishing a book area, a writing area, a listening area, as well as guidance on encouraging vocabulary and more. But for those who have read Essentials and are eager to take a deeper dive into language and literacy development, particularly from an equity perspective, what resources would you recommend for further learning?
Okay, so now this is a good question. I'm going to share 2 resources that guide our thinking and our work at the Rollins Center, but there are many, many others. I did mention that we're grateful to have at the Speech School and the Rollins Center relationship and engagement with some of our nation's leading language and literacy scholars. So there is much more than what I'm going to share here that guides our work, but I know in the interest of time, I'm going to share 2. So as I said, there are many good resources out there, and please, what I'm going to share is not an exhaustive list by what guides our thinking at the Speech School and the Rollins Center, but 2 of our most recent reads, Cultivating Genius by Dr. Gholdy Muhammad, and Reader Come Home by Dr. Marianne Wolf. So I referenced Dr. Marianne Wolf in her definition around the deep reading brain earlier in our conversation. But what these authors have in common and what these pieces of work have in common is an assignment of equity through literacy, aligned with what we do, an assignment of equity through literacy. Dr. Gholdy Muhammad's text provides a framework for developing language and literacy through the lens of equity by promoting identity, criticality, and skill and intellectual development. Reader Come Home challenges us to think about the impact of technology on reading and what that impact means for equity, justice, and democracy in the long term. And so, that's just a description of those texts at the high level. But again, these experts are thinking about and recognize all of our assignment of equity through literacy. So we're not thinking about literacy again as a destination, because that is so limiting, right? If you think about the way that we define proficiency, literal comprehension, and being able to make inferences from text, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about deep literacy as a vehicle, as a path for self-determination. Our national data tells us that right now about 30% of our kids are reading proficiently. That means And overwhelmingly, what, almost 70% are not on a path to self-determination. We've got to change that. And of course, those numbers are even more abysmal when we disaggregate them by race and SES and so forth, English language learner status. So all of us have that assignment of equity through literacy, and that starts from birth. That starts with the work that our early care and learning teachers are doing in the infant toddler classroom, in the preschool pre-K environment, right? That early language interaction, that early rich language interaction that our children are getting from their teachers in the infant toddler classroom forms the later foundation for reading comprehension and deep reading, right? So all of this work is connected along a continuum. Our early childhood educators are the most important. They're the cornerstone, the pillar, our catalyst for being able to change these long-term outcomes for kids.
Do you hear that, early childhood educators? You heard it here. Yes.
And I mean, I think it's important, Savannah, because, you know, we have not yet in the United States really reconciled with the fact that our early childhood educators have the most difficult job. And when I say we haven't reconciled that, it's because we haven't addressed the pay gaps there, right? We haven't addressed the professional progression, professional learning that needs to happen for that group. I mean, we have a long way to go. But at the Rollins Center, at the speech school, I mean, we recognize that without early care and learning, without the work that our early childhood teachers do, there is no deep reading that can happen. There is no path to self-determination without the critical work of our birth to five educators.
Absolutely. Yes.
As you can see, I'm very passionate. I'm very passionate about that topic.
Yes, absolutely. And we, of course, fully agree and are continuously advocating for those changes in the field that are absolutely so critical. So I'm really grateful you brought that up and fully in agreement. So thank you so much. And as we begin to wrap up today, since we've been talking about literacy, we have to ask, what was your favorite book as a child? And is there a book that you're most excited to read to your children or children in general?
That's another good question. So I just remember as a child, my parents always reading the children's encyclopedias to me, which I thoroughly enjoyed. I think I mentioned to you before we jumped on that my husband is an educator as well. He's an English language arts teacher and now assistant principal. And so we are a family of educators. We read to our babies all the time. I can share with you a text that we most recently were reading to our 5-year-old. And let me just make sure I get the author right, because that will be important. Give me 1 second. It's the author of this text, Floyd Cooper, Juneteenth for Maisie. And so you're probably familiar that last week, Dr. Joe Biden made Juneteenth a federal holiday. And so we've been reading to our sweet girl all about Juneteenth and Juneteenth, and Floyd Cooper in that text, really, the imagery, for one, is outstanding. And we also listened to the book on tape through Audible. But that text is so fantastic for us because it really speaks to the theme of equity, the theme of freedom, the theme of liberation for all, not just for some, but all. And as another note, even though I know you didn't ask me this, I just want to put this out there that something that I didn't talk about is, and sort of I touched on in the beginning about children needing to see themselves. Diverse literature is critical. Children need to have access in the birth to 5 space. Teachers need to be reading from texts that represent the experiences of diverse characters. It's so critical. One of my colleagues, Dr. Lakeisha Johnson, has an organization called Maya's Book Nook, and it is all about providing resources, texts, book lists, guides, activities for birth to 5 educators around diverse children's literature. So I want to put that out there because it's something that I sort of touched on in the beginning. And as you ask this question about what I'm reading to my kids and what is of interest to us, but really is really needs to be at the forefront of what we do is exposure to diverse children's literature, because we want all of our children to see, again, a prerequisite around feeling like you can see yourself, feeling like the adults in your environment, in your school value you, comes through in access to diverse children's literature.
Absolutely. And we love Juneteenth for Maisie. We actually shared the Read Aloud YouTube version to our social media channels last week. Oh, it's so phenomenal. Love it as well. And we'll put that link. Was it Maya's Nook?
Yes, it is Maya's Book Nook. It's MAYASBOOKNOOK. Maya's Book Nook.
Perfect. I just wanted to make sure our audience got that. And we will place that also in the comments below so that everyone can take a look.
Awesome. Awesome. I'm trying to think about all the things that I can share. Of course, there's so much, but we just, again, Savannah, grateful for this opportunity to share. And as things come up for me, I'll be sure to shoot you an email because I know you're compiling a list for the listeners today.
Oh, that would be great. Thank you so much. And as we wrap up today, are there any new projects or publications or anything in particular you're working on now that you'd like to tell our audience about?
Sure. Let me keep it short and sweet. On the Cox campus, we are developing a summer learning journey and a year-long learning journey for birth to 5 educators. What does that look like? That looks like curated coursework around the science of early brain development and language development and literacy development that's relevant for teachers in the birth to 5 space. So curated content, video-based coursework for summer, and a year-long journey that is all focused on, again, this building. What does it mean to build a language-rich ecosystem? What does it mean to build the deep reading brain? So we've got that curated coursework in the form of a summer journey and resources, book guides, book lists, you name it, phonological awareness activities, assessments, you name it, that begins this summer for educators on the Cox campus, but carries out throughout the year. And so if I could highlight one of the projects that we're working on now, I'd highlight that. Because I believe that that's going to be most significant for your audience as they begin to return to school. We'll also have hot off the press trauma-informed content on the Cox campus, focused on providing strategies for the early care and learning teacher. Again, Ralph Smith has forewarned us. We're getting ready to be faced with welcoming our most developmentally diverse group of students. What does that look like? Our students have experienced a lot. Some of our students have experienced trauma. What does it look like to meet our students on the first day? And so our summer learning journey, our year-long journey for birth to 5 educators focuses on exactly that.
So glad I asked. That's such a timely resource, and we definitely will share that with our audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Savannah. Thank you to the council. Thank you to my colleagues at the Rollins Center and at the speech school. Oh my gosh, thank you to the listeners. We are so grateful. And we do not, on behalf of my organization, we don't take this opportunity to share for granted. We take our responsibility very seriously. And so to be engaged with the council is just a real privilege of ours. So thank you so much, Savannah.
It's a tremendous honor for us to have the chance to speak with you today. And we also want to thank the Rollins Center at the Atlanta Speech School as well, and really commend you for the work that you're doing that's making a huge impact, probably beyond what we can see now, well into the future. So thank you so much for coming on today, and hope you have a wonderful rest of your afternoon. Dr. Riley, James,
So
everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Savannah.
Thank you everyone for tuning in.